to our friends in Poland, the Polish government in particular, for everything that they have been doing when it comes to supporting Ukrainians.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. In 2017, the UK government introduced a visa concession for offshore wind farm workers, which is extended for 1 year in July 2021. This visa concession effectively allows offshore wind farm companies to undercut the pay and conditions of British seafarers and exploit overseas workers. A few weeks ago, the Prime Minister committed to expanding offshore wind farms. So, in light of the disgraceful decision by P&O Ferries to sack 786 British seafarers and replace them with exploited foreign labour, will the Home Office commit to ending this offshore wind farm worker concession to ensure that UK seafarers are able to fairly compete for these jobs?
The gentleman makes very important points. I'm very happy to pick up with him directly on this, because we don't have time to give you a full answer. I'll happily speak to him about this.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. In recent months, we've seen an increase in totally unacceptable antisocial behaviour in Burnley and Padiham town centres, as well as dirt bikes racing up and down Padiham Greenway. Could I ask the Home Secretary to meet with me in Padiham to talk to businesses and residents about what more we can do to tackle this issue?
Delighted, Mr. Speaker, to come to his constituency, do exactly that, and perhaps we could have a conversation about the Safer Street Funds, which will certainly assist on this issue.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm really getting so sick and tired of every time anybody on this side of the House talks about our disgust with the abandoned people in Rwanda scheme. That side starts shouting, what are your plans? Well, if they'd paid any attention in the 6 full weeks, of the Nationality and Borders Bill, read up on the multiple amendments that we put forward that this side voted down, and then you'll know what our plans are. But
the question is meant to be, not to her.
The question is, I submitted a written question because the main response to this is safe and legal routes, and they keep saying they have them. I submitted a written question asking for the detail of all of those available. And do you know what, Mr. Speaker? The detail fits on that size of a page, because there's practically none for the entire world.
I may say to the Honourable Lady, first of all, she's read the new plan for immigration, and I hope she has. She'll be very clear about the government's policy around safe and legal routes. I have already, during questions today, Mr. Speaker, outlined a number of safe and legal routes that this government has committed to, including 2 routes for Ukrainian nationals and the 2 routes for those that fled Afghanistan last year.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. People are exploited, beaten, robbed, raped and even die. And we need to do everything we can to stamp out this evil trade. Does my right honourable friend agree with me and the vast majority of residents of Rother Valley that this Rwanda plan is not only the right thing to do, as it will cut down on illegal immigration and reduce pressure on public services, but will ultimately save lives?
Well, my honourable friend is absolutely right, and while the benches opposite just yell out about their lack of support, I think actually I come back to a number of points, Mr. Speaker. Is first of all, doing nothing is not an option. We have to do everything we possibly can to break up these evil people smugglers who, are unhinged. They'll do nothing, basically, to exploit individuals. The final point, of course, Mr. Speaker, is it is through the new plan for immigration and our wider work through borders and nationality, which is coming back to the House tomorrow, that we want to bring this plan together and deliver for the British people.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. On March the 30th, Lord Harrington had to apologise for inadvertently misleading the other place when he said that a drop-down arrow was available on the form for Ukrainian refugees in the Ukrainian language. But when he apologised, he said this was in train. Can she fess up and confirm that it's Home Office policy not to have a translated version of the form, or if it isn't, where's Lord Harrington's severely delayed train?
Mr. Speaker, if I may, for officials, Home Office officials that work on this scheme, there is guidance around dealing with different languages and the way in which applications are being dealt with. But I'm very happy to pick up with him directly on this.
Mr. Speaker, I very much welcome the fact that dozens of visas have already been granted by this United Kingdom government for Ukrainians to come to the Scottish borders in my constituency. However, will the Home Secretary work with me to iron out the last remaining issues that some of my constituents have in terms of processing the applications to ensure that more Ukrainians can come to the Scottish borders?
Yes, thank you, Mr. Speaker. My honourable friend is absolutely right on this. There is work underway, actually, to ensure that we can bring more Ukrainian nationals through our 2 routes to come to Scotland. I'm very happy to meet with him and with the Minister to discuss this further.
Speaker. My constituent, Graham Hughes, is today doing his latest run to a humanitarian run to Poland and hopes to return with a Ukrainian refugee and her 11-year-old daughter, who recently managed to escape the horrors of Mariupol shortly before the evacuation routes closed, but they're now waiting anxiously in Lviv. Despite Graham and his partner applying to sponsor them nearly a month ago, they're yet to be granted passage to the UK. Graham and Catherine are ready to bring these people to safety in Durham. Will the Home Secretary do everything possible to expedite this?
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. First of all, I'd like to, through the Honourable Lady, pass on our thanks to her constituent, obviously, who is now travelling to Poland. I will need the details, if I may take the details from her, to ensure that both the visa side and the sponsorship side do actually match up, and then obviously we can pick that up.
All my right Nottinghamshire Police on hitting their recruitment uplift target a year ahead of schedule, so that we now have more police officers in Nottinghamshire than at any time in the last 10 years. And can she commit to a date when the long-promised police funding formula review will start?
First of all, if I may, I would just like to commend Nottinghamshire Police and your outstanding Chief Constable, if I may say so, as well, for all the work that the team have been doing, and actually really focusing on driving down crime through recruitment and the training of new officers. She rightly asked about police funding formula, which clearly is something that is underway through the Policing Minister. It is deeply complicated, and she'll be well aware of that, but we're happy to report back on this.
Stephanie Peacock.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. One mother from Barnsley submitted her daughter's passport application in January, 5 months in advance of their holiday next week, but is yet to receive it. My office have had to wait 2 hours to speak to someone at the Home Office today. What is the Minister doing to address the unacceptable delays in passport applications?
Mr. Speaker, the Honourable Lady heard the comments from the Minister earlier on about the Passport Office and work there. But it is unusual, if I may. She said her constituent submitted the case of the passport in January. If we can have the details, we'll pick that up. But that is a very, very unusual delay. It must be a problem.
Lee Anderson.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Now then, the world-class Rwanda plan has been welcomed by anybody who actually lives in the real world, because it saves lives in the Channel. Unfortunately, that lot opposite there don't live in the real world. But does the Home Secretary agree with me that the Labour Party have got a chance now to either back this plan or back the criminals?
The Honourable friend, as ever, is very, very clear it's world-class and a world first, and something we are proud of. And actually, Mr. Speaker, it's in a partnership. It is a partnership that our partners in Rwanda are proud of as well. They have an exceptional history of resettlement of refugees. And he, of course, is absolutely right. The British people want change. They absolutely do. We say to everyone today, back the plan, but also back the Nationality and Borders Bill.
Judith Cummins.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm extremely concerned about the safeguarding of our young people at outdoor music festivals, because these festivals attract over 7.1 million people, many of them who are under 18. And currently there's more provision made in licensing over the recycling of a plastic cup than for our young people who have suffered serious sexual assault, including rape, by spiking. So will the Minister work with me and others to create a gold standard of licensing for these events to protect our young people?
I'm very happy to work with the Honourable Lady. We've already spoken about this issue, actually, and I'm grateful for her interest in it. Of course, as the country gets back to festivals this summer, we all want young women and girls especially, and all young people, to enjoy themselves safely. So I will work with her across government to take forward the asks that she's presented to us.
Rob Butler.
Speaker, I've been very alarmed to hear of large-scale and dangerous hare coursing in my constituency, where heavily armed people are coming onto farmers' land and then live-streaming these chases to China where there is heavy betting being put on the chases. So will my right honourable friend support Thames Valley Police in their efforts to tackle this appalling offence and reassure farmers in Buckinghamshire that rural crime will always be taken seriously by this government?
Well, my honourable friend is absolutely right. He knows the strength of feeling around this issue amongst the front bench and colleagues on our side of the House, which is why we have the Police Crime Courts and Sentencing Bill that we are urging everyone to back. And I would like to commend Thames Valley Police in particular for everything that they're doing on this.
We now come to the first of the two statements. I call the Secretary of State for Defence, Ben Wallace.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It's now been 61 days since Russia invaded Ukraine, and it has been 74 days since my Russia counterpart assured me that the Russian army would not be invading. As the invasion approaches its 9th week, I want to update the House on the current situation and what steps we are taking to further our support to the Ukrainian people. It is our assessment that approximately 15,000 Russian personnel have been killed during their offensive. Alongside the death toll or the equipment losses, and in total, a number of sources suggest that to date, over 2,000 armoured vehicles have been destroyed or captured. This includes at least 530 tanks, 530 armoured personnel carriers, and 560 infantry fighting vehicles. Russia has also lost over 60 helicopters and fighter jets. The offensive that was supposed to take a maximum of a week has now taken weeks. Last week, Russia admitted that the Slava-class cruiser Moskva has sunk, the second key naval asset that they have lost since invading, significantly weakening their ability to bring their maritime assets to bear from the Black Sea. As I said, Mr. Speaker, in my last statement, Russia has so far failed in nearly every one of its objectives. In recognition of this failure, the Russian High Command has regrouped, reinforced and changed focus to securing Donetsk and Luhansk Oblast. A failure of the Russian Ministry of Defence commander control at all levels has meant they have now appointed one overall commander, General Dvornikov. At the start of this conflict, Russia had committed over 120 battalion tactical groups, approximately 65% of its entire ground combat strength. As of now, we assess that around over 25% of these have been rendered not combat effective. Ukraine, Mr. Speaker, is an inspiration to us all. Their brave people have never stopped fighting for their lands. They have endured indiscriminate bombardment, war crimes and overwhelming military aggression. But they have stood firm, galvanised the international community and beaten back the army of Russia in the north and the northeast. We anticipate that this next phase of the invasion will be an attempt by Russia to occupy further the Donbass and connect via Mariupol the Crimea. And so it is urgent that we in the international community ensure Ukraine gets the aid and weapons it so much needs. As Defence Secretary, I have ensured that of each step of the way, the UK's support is tailored to the anticipated actions of Russia. To date, we have provided more than 5,000 anti-tank missiles, 5 air defence systems with more than 100 missiles, 1,360 anti-structural munitions, 4.5 tonnes of plastic explosives. And in response to indiscriminate bombing from the air and escalation by President Putin's forces on the 9th of March, I announced the UK would supply Starstreak high-velocity and low-velocity anti-air missiles. I'm able to now report to the House that these have been in theatre for over 3 weeks and have been deployed and used by Ukrainian forces to defend themselves and their territory. Over recess, my ministerial team, Mr. Speaker, hosted a Ukrainian government delegation at Salisbury Plain training area to explore further equipment options. This was quickly followed by the Prime Minister announcing a further £100 million worth of high-grade military equipment, 120 armoured vehicles, sourcing anti-ship missiles and high-tech loitering munitions for precision strikes. But as we can see from Ukrainians' requests, more still needs to be done. So for that reason, I can now announce to the House that we shall be gifting a small number of armoured vehicles fitted with launchers for those anti-air missiles. These Stormer vehicles will give Ukraine forces enhanced short-range anti-air capabilities both day and night. Since my last statement, more countries have answered the call and more have stepped up to support. The Czech Republic has supplied T-72 tanks and BMP fighting vehicles, and Poland has also pledged T-72 tanks. Mr. Speaker, the quickest route to help Ukraine is with similar equipment and ammunition to what they already use. The UK government obviously does not hold Russian equipment, but in order to help where we do not have such stock, we have enabled and others to donate. Alongside Canada and Poland, the Royal Air Force has been busy moving equipment from donor countries to Ukraine. And at the same time, if no donor can be found, we are making purchasing equipment from the open market. On the 31st of March, I held my second international donor conference, involving an increase of countries to 35 countries, including representatives from the EU and NATO. So far, these efforts have yielded some 2.5 million items of equipment worth over £1.5 billion. These next 3 weeks are key. Ukraine needs more long-range artillery and ammunition, and both Russian and NATO caliber types to accompany them. They also seek anti-ship missiles to counter Russian ships that are able to bombard Ukrainian cities. Mr. Speaker, it is therefore important to say that if possible, the UK will seek to enable to supply each weapons. I shall keep the House up to date and also members of each front bench across the House as we proceed. The MOD is working day and night to support, alongside the US, Canada and the EU, continued logistical supplies. But not all the aid is lethal. We have also sent significant quantities of non-lethal equipment to Ukraine. To date, we've sent over 90,000 ration packs, over 10 pallets of medical equipment, more than 3,000 pieces of body armour, nearly 77,000 helmets and 3,000 pairs of boots, and much more, including communications equipment and air defence. On top of our military aid to Ukraine, we contribute to strengthening NATO's collective security for both the immediate challenge and the long term. We have temporarily doubled the number of defensive personnel in Estonia, sent military personnel to support Lithuania intelligence, resilience and reconnaissance efforts, deployed hundreds of Royal Marines to Poland, and sent offshore patrol vessels and Navy destroyers to the eastern Mediterranean. We've also increased our presence in the skies over southeastern Europe with 4 additional Typhoons based in Romania. That means we now have a full squadron of RAF fighter jets in southern Europe ready to support NATO tasking. As the Prime Minister announced on Friday, we are also offering a deployment of British Challenger 2 tanks to Poland to bridge the gap between Poland donating tanks to Ukraine and their replacement arriving from a third country. Looking further ahead, NATO is reassessing its posture, and the UK is leading conversations at NATO about how best the alliance can deter and defend against threats. My NATO colleagues and I tasked the alliance to report to leaders at the summit in June with proposals for concrete, long-term and sustainable changes. Mr. Speaker, some of us in this House knew that behind the mask, the Kremlin was not the international statement it pretended to be. With this invasion of Ukraine, all of Europe can now see the true face of President Putin and his inner circle. His intention is only to destroy, to crush, to rub out the free peoples of Ukraine. He does not want to preserve. He must not be allowed to prevail. Ukrainians are fighting for their very lives, and they are fighting for our freedoms. The President of Ukraine himself said it as much. If Russia stops fighting, there will be peace. If Ukraine stops fighting, there will be no more Ukraine. Thank you.
I now come to the Shadow Secretary of State, John Healey.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I thank the Secretary of State for his statement and say his presence is welcomed this afternoon by the whole House, Mr. Speaker. We know it's not entirely his fault, but it's nearly 7 weeks since he was last able to give us a statement on the situation in Ukraine. That was the day after President Zelensky addressed this House. He said then, as he said this afternoon, that he will keep the House up to date. And can I just say on behalf of the public, we would welcome more regular statements as the Russian war on Ukraine continues. Like the Secretary of State, Mr. Speaker, we salute the bravery of the Ukrainian people, the military and civilians alike. It is led by President Zelensky personally, but it's typified by the military last stand of those troops in the Azovstal steel plant and by the people's resistance in Russian-occupied Kherson. We also renew our total condemnation of this brutal Russian invasion of a sovereign country and our determination to see all those responsible for the mass graves in Mariupol, the crimes and rapes and assassinations in Bucha, and the civilian bombings in almost every town and city across Ukraine. We are determined to see them pursued to the end for their war crimes. Mr. Speaker, we welcome the role the UK is playing. We welcome the further UK military assistance to Ukraine that the Secretary of State has outlined today. This has our full Labour support. The Defence Secretary says the UK has provided 5,000 anti-tank missiles, 100 anti-air missiles. These direct donations are a fraction of the total, so can he tell us what the current total of such weapons provided so far by Western allies is? And can he tell us whether the MOD has yet signed contracts and started production of replacement NLAWs and Starstreak missiles? This is the first day of the third month of Putin's invasion. This is a new phase, as the Defence Secretary has said. What is needed now is no longer old spare weapons from the Soviet era, but new NATO weapons that Ukraine will need for Putin's next offensive against Odessa or Kiev. We need to shift from crisis management in response to the current conflict to delivering medium-term military support that Ukraine will need in future. So what is the Secretary of State doing to ensure this step change in support takes place? And given that 5 million refugees have now left Ukraine, what is the Secretary of State doing to offer the 700 personnel still held at high readiness in the UK for humanitarian help? And is it still the case that the MOD has only offered 140 Armed Forces personnel to help sort out the shameful shambles of the Home Office visa and refugee system? Mr. Speaker, I've just got off the tube from visiting NATO's Allied Maritime Command in Northwood. They took my phone off me, so I hadn't realised we were having a statement, which is why I'm using handwritten notes this afternoon. But this is a proud, professional, British-led, multinational command. And I pay tribute to the work that they are doing day in, day out to keep us all safe. NATO has proved such a powerful security alliance because it pools such multinational military capacity, capability and cash, with an annual budget over $1 trillion to protect 1 billion people. But Ukraine, Mr. Speaker, reminds us that the greatest threat to UK security lies in Europe, in the North Atlantic and the Arctic, not the Indo-Pacific. This reinforces NATO as our primary UK security obligation. But I say to the Secretary of State, he's given us a paragraph in his statement today on NATO. Our leadership in NATO could be at risk as Britain falls behind allies in responding to this Ukraine invasion. More than a dozen European countries are now rebooting security plans and defence spending, but the UK has not yet done either. Can I urge him, therefore, to revisit the integrated review, review defence spending, reform military procurement and rethink his army cuts? Because, Mr. Speaker, we will be dealing with the consequences of Putin's war for many years to come. And now is the time for longer-term thinking about how the strategy for European security must change.
Secretary of State.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I'm grateful to the Right Honourable Member Officer. And I apologise, we had spoken last week, I think, about timing of this, and I had hoped to do the statement tomorrow, but the United States has called a 40-nation meeting in Germany tomorrow, and I will therefore not be here. So I took the opportunity when I can, so I'm sorry if he has cut short his trip. I'll be delighted to arrange with the Navy for him to return to the headquarters without his phones, maybe for longer, in custody. Mr. Speaker, as I said, I promised to keep the House updated, and I have not only briefed a number of our colleagues from this House from across parties on a number of occasions, I've also given members access to our intelligence officials and indeed senior generals to get the latest throughout. And my honourable friend, the Minister of the Armed Forces, has had 2 debates and I think answered 1 UQ. I won't take the credit for the UQ. I think governments get UQ, but nevertheless it is an opportunity. We will continue to update all members, and I'm very happy to have another cross-house sort of dial-in for all members on that subject, and I think it is incredibly important that we do so. Just like calibrating our response to Russia, it's important that the government calibrates its response within the House, that we make sure that everything is not a surprise to members, and indeed that we consult as we go along. The Right Honourable Member asked questions about NLAWs and Star Treat. We have an ongoing relationship with the industry. We will be replacing them or are replacing them. Not surprisingly, there's now a lot of interest in those British-made products, but nevertheless it is very important that we replenish our stocks and we are obviously in that line to do so. The Treasury has agreed to fund the new for old of replacements of those, but it is very important, given the state of the Russian government, that we make sure we replenish as soon as we can. It is a daily relationship with our industry. The Minister of Defence Procurement speaks to them at least once a week. The Prime Minister will soon convene a meeting with all the leads to make sure that we are doing everything we can, not just for ourselves, but also for Ukraine and others, to make sure. And sometimes there is a bit, Mr. Speaker, a bit of juggling where I release something we don't yet need to go to another country so they can have it first, or whether threat is more pressing, or indeed persuade a friendly country to divert their order to be able to come to us or to Ukraine. And we are often involved in that basic defence diplomacy where we know a country is buying something like an NLAW, they don't need it right now, could we take it off their hands, and then they delay it. So we try and make sure we do that as much as possible. I'm delighted to place in the House, Mr. Speaker, the international update of how much has been donated. Obviously, some countries are more open than others about what they have done, and so what I will place in the library is a table showing those based on, it's not for me to let another country's identity be known if they wish to keep it secret, but what we can publish, we shall. What I can inform the House is that in the last week alone, for example, we've supplied 1,000 anti-tank weapons, 14 Wolfhound armoured vehicles, 4,000 night vision goggles has gone in the week alone, and that is, I can update further that we have supplied also to date 5,361 NLAWs from the original 2,000, over 200 javelins, 104 high velocity and low velocity missile for anti-air, which will grow to over 250, and obviously if there are any more new weapon types I will inform the House as we do that. On the statement of NATO, one of the discussions we will have in the sidelines tomorrow is obviously about what future for NATO. NATO defence ministers a few weeks ago in Brussels, we tasked NATO to go away and come back with its long-term plans. I think the Right Honourable Member is very right. We're in crisis management, we're in short-term response, but we need a long-term plan. We need to know what will NATO look like and how will Western Europe, or Europe including many of its new members, contain Putin after all this has passed, because we have a man who has clearly been involved in an illegal invasion of a country, war crimes against the Ukrainian people, and how are we going to live with that neighbour in Europe should he still remain, and that is an important consideration for all of us. And it does go to its heart of defence reform and our spending. Of course, as I've always said, as the threat changes, so must our defence posture, and indeed that includes funding. As I've said publicly, the here and now, Mr. Speaker, we are getting the spending we need, but he is right to raise the issue of medium and long-term funding, which we will definitely be looking at. In addition to his point about we are now the only country, that is because we were the first country, Mr. Speaker, when we had our £24 billion settlement. No one else had gone there yet in NATO. Sweden had gone, but they weren't in. Australia had gone. So the Right Honourable Member's comments are slightly punishing Britain for being the first, because it was way before the invasion of Ukraine. A lot of these increases have been afterwards. That isn't to say that we shouldn't look at what more we can all do and how that knocks into other areas. Thank you.
That's good. We now come to the Chair of the Select Committee, Tobias Elwood.
Mr Speaker, you heard it there first. There's a request for more urgent questions, which I'm happy to oblige. Could I very much welcome this statement here today that focuses on the operational. A reality is now dawning, however, that this conflict could last months, indeed years, but also more widely that Europe has actually entered a new and dangerous era of insecurity. So I pose two fundamental questions to the Secretary of State. Firstly, what does success in Ukraine look like? Are we doing enough to prevent Ukraine from losing, but not enough to make sure that they win? What is our strategy? Is it to push Russia back from the pre-February lines, or indeed liberate the entire Donbass region? If it's in Europe's wider security interest to see Putin humiliated in Ukraine, then the entire mainland must be liberated. That must be our strategic aim. And the second fundamental issue, and he touched on it, is our defence posture. Threats are increasing, but pressures on our armed forces are growing, as indeed is our equipment as well. Is it not now time to increase defence spending to 3%?
Secretary of State.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My right honourable friend is a doughty campaigner for 3% of spending, and I consider him my long-range artillery when it comes to potentially the lobbying in the long term, whatever we see as a result of Ukraine. Look, our strategic aim is twofold. One is that Putin must fail in Ukraine, he must fail in his invasion, and I think he is on course to do that, actually. He must fail in his occupation of Ukraine, and I think he has definitely failed in achieving that. To the fine-tuning of that is as much a matter of Ukraine's choice as it is of anybody else. That Ukraine gets to choose where it wishes to settle for peace. We will do everything we can to support them. For my part, Mr. Speaker, I want Putin not only beyond the pre-February boundaries. He invaded Crimea illegally, he invaded Donetsk illegally, and he should comply with international law and, in the long run, leave Ukraine. And overall, the cost and the consequence of what he has done, he needs to wear it on his shoulders.
We now come to SNP spokesperson Dave Dugan.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I'd like to thank the Secretary of State for advance sight of his statement. We, on these benches, welcome the sight of the additional measures taken to support Ukraine on behalf of the United Kingdom, and we also welcome the engagement that I know the Secretary of State has had with the SNP leadership in this place. Mr. Speaker, his statement highlights the bravery of Ukraine's defence forces, but I'm sure he also acknowledges that alongside this bravery is an exceptional tactical efficacy in stark contrast to the Russian invaders, and I'm sure he'd have no hesitation in agreeing with that observation. The Secretary of State highlights in his statement Russia's apparent reduced ambition to consolidate in the east of Ukraine around Donbass, and through Mariupol tried to secure a land bridge to Crimea. Can he reassure the House today that enduring economic pressure and further military support will continue to frustrate this Russian ambition of aggression? It was a great pleasure for me to meet the Royal Marine Commandos from 4-5 Commando in Arbroath in Warsaw earlier this month. But what more can be done by NATO allies to ensure that our partners on the eastern flank of NATO are further reassured around NATO's determination to stand firm against any and all aggression towards our allies? And finally, I welcome the details of the £100 million for higher grade equipment, including anti-ship missiles. As the Secretary of State will be all too well aware, you don't get an awful lot of higher grade equipment for £100 million. So I'd welcome any further advice he can give us on that. And in terms specifically of anti-ship role, can he confirm that brimstone missiles have no role in that application? And can he discuss with us, if possible, what role the UK's Harpoon missiles will have in that application? And if we're not donating UK stocks of Harpoon missiles, is that because we don't have enough ourselves? Thank you.
Minister.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Just on the Harpoon, we're not at present providing Harpoon. Our Harpoon missiles are launched from ships, whereas very few nations, I don't think any nowadays, launch from land Harpoon. It was there's a lot of media around this invasion, Mr. Speaker, and there was a day go past where I have to counter just stories that have appeared somehow made up, some of them, I think. The AS-90 going to Ukraine was another story that appeared in the Daily Express this weekend. No, they're not. So I don't know where that came from, but it is not. So on that, on brimstone missiles, we made a commitment, I think nearly 18 months ago, 2 years ago, when we were selling fast attack patrol boats to Ukraine, that we would sell it armed with maritime brimstone missiles. We would do that. They are not at present in the country. Those ships have not been yet purchased or delivered. However, if we wish to provide brimstones in whatever guises they are, I will inform members of this House when we do it. I don't close it off as an opportunity. I think it is a perfectly legitimate thing. There are different sophistications between Block 1, which is just land brimstone, to developments that we've never bought that they can do at sea. So they are range in their capabilities. And I think first and foremost, we will look to provide, if we do, brimstone for the land using stock we already hold, but not as yet on the sea. What more can we do for our eastern colleagues? I would always advise colleagues, and many of you here already know about the Joint Expeditionary Force, which is a tremendous group of the 10 Nordic countries. I recently asked my colleagues from around the House to the dinner when we had the Jeff Summit here in the UK. They are Scandinavian and the Baltic states, the United Kingdom, Iceland. They are a tremendous grouping of people. Some people describe them as the beer-drinking nations. I'm less charitable and describe it as the nations with probably the worst weather in Europe, so that's what uniquely binds us together. But we are the doers in Europe. We get on and do it, we share, we exercise, we train together, and it also involves Finland and Sweden, and I think that's a very, very good group. And as to 4-5 Commander in Arbroath, they have done an excellent job, are doing an excellent job, and they are, as he says, in Poland, and they are incredibly professional, and there is more work for them to do.
So Julian Lewis.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It's clear that the supply and use of missiles has turned military assets such as ships, aircraft and tanks into costly losses and liabilities. The one gap appears to be artillery. I know the Secretary of State said that we're supplying some artillery, but as the earlier episodes show, the counter to a weapon system is not necessarily the same weapon system, but a missile to destroy it. What can be done to prevent the one area that Russia still seems to be succeeding in, which is the use of artillery to raise cities to the ground without engaging Ukrainian forces properly?
First State.
I think my right honourable friend has put his finger right on the heart of the current race, and the race is on to equip Ukraine with the same long-range capabilities that Russia has, so that they are not outranged and indeed pinned down. That's why we first and foremost started with sourcing around the world 152mm, so Soviet calibre, so they can keep going with that. And in parallel, a number of nations we are exploring with providing either 105, which is our main sort of lightweight guns, and the 155 in more mobile versions than the big armoured AS-90s, because one of the things that this modern battlefield is showing is you better move quickly once you've fired your guns, because you can be found very quickly by pretty cheap off-the-shelf UAVs. And so, exactly as he said, in parallel there's a race on. We've now seen a number of eastern countries providing 155 howitzers. That unlocks NATO ammunition. We'll play our part and make sure it gets to them. In addition, you've got to improve the intelligence that goes around artillery, so we are exploring counter-battery radar, so that as soon as Russia fires a shell at you, you know exactly where it comes from and you can return the favour.
Speaker, the Secretary of State may have heard that I've been calling for more regular performance. I'm a great admirer of his, but I've just been starved of his company. I'm very pleased to have this statement today, but is he aware that many of us are encouraged by the information we've given today, but people in Mariupol have been dying of starvation and no water. We have a navy. Hasn't it been possible to supply food, water, that sort of stuff by sea? It may be that I'm not a logistics or military expert, but it seems strange those people have been starving and we haven't sent food.
So, State.
I understand his deep sense of frustration, not from listening to me, but obviously from regards to the people of Mariupol. Look, nations of the Black Sea govern the Black Sea through something called the Montreux Declaration, which is a very old piece of law. And at times of war, they can shut the Black Sea to any nation other than Black Sea nations. Turkey did that at the very beginning. That actually disadvantages Russia greater than anything else. And therefore we couldn't go in even if we wish. I'd already spoken to the Turks and the Romanians about minesweeping capability, because what is clear is that this summer a lot of the grain won't go out through Ukraine, but it might go out through neighbouring countries as Romania, and that's really important. But at the moment it is not possible for us to put ships into the Black Sea, and Russia will not be able to replace its ships, but it does give them at the moment another sense of strength of trying to control the area, which is why the Ukrainians need anti-ship missiles to make sure that they get at least some access to their coastline.
Blake Drummond.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. As Russia flounders on the battlefields of Ukraine due to the bravery of the Ukrainians, President Putin has raised the possibility of using tactical nuclear weapons. Can my right honourable friend ensure that the government and our allies does everything it can to deter the President Putin from taking this disastrous step?
We've all seen with concern the playing in of the nuclear weapons by Putin, either in the earlier statements or indeed recent test fires. Look, I think the first thing is to remind colleagues that NATO is a nuclear alliance. Britain, America and France obviously are in possession of nuclear weapons, and that is first and foremost a strong deterrent to him. He can invest in lots of different types of missiles, but fundamentally some are out there right now under the sea, are brave men and women of the Royal Navy, silent and able to deliver an effect of nuclear if they had to in defence of this kingdom, and indeed in effect in defence of NATO. And it's incredibly important that he doesn't forget that.
Kevan Jones.
Can I thank the Secretary of State for his statement? Can I commend his leadership and his team's leadership throughout this crisis? He's already outlined quite an impressive list of equipment that ourselves, our NATO allies and EU allies have provided for Ukraine. Some of that we provide is legacy equipment, other is from inventory. So could he assure me that the cost of that is coming from the Treasury's Central Reserve and not the defence budget?
My right honourable colleague asked a very important question. Yes, to date we have gifted in aid £200 million, which we propose will grow to £500 million to Ukraine. The Treasury have agreed to old for new in funding that replacement.
Bob Seeley.
Mr. Speaker, I wrote to the Secretary of State last week about a few issues, and I'm hoping he'll have a chance to look at the letter today that comes with a present from some Ukrainian soldiers. Can I return to the issue of 155 spec? Because this is a potential game changer. Is he saying that we're leaving it up to other countries on this because we don't have the field guns ourselves, or will he be looking at supplying AS-90, or has he ruled AS-90 out altogether? Secondly, there are some very specific naval supplies mentioned in the letter, but more generally, from Odessa to Zaporozhye, there is a lack of body armour still and medical kits. And what reassurance can he give me on them? Thank you.
So on body armour, we'll be flowing more body armour next week to Ukraine. The United States is sending 200,000 155 shells, and I think 2 battalions worth of 155 tubes. I'm not a gunner, but apparently that's the terms to do that. At the same time, we will scour whatever we can. They're also interested in the 105, our guns as well, and we will look to provide that as well. Look, the AS-90 is a very old 155 armoured vehicle, as he knows. They're over 40 tonnes. One of the challenges with that is to get it from one side of Ukraine to the other, low loaders, big logistics, and I think if we can help source 155s that are more mobile and more modern, then I think that's the better way to proceed.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I too would like to put on record my thanks to the right honourable gentleman towards me as an opposition spokesman for defence, his cooperative attitude. At a recent meeting of the Servants of the People Party, which is incidentally a sister party of my own party, an impassioned plea was made. And the plea was this. As the Russians have retreated from parts of the Ukraine, they have left a ghastly and deadly legacy in the shape of landmines. Yeah. Now, the Ukrainians are doing their very best to get rid of this hideous, hideous calling card. But already a number of Ukrainians have been killed in their efforts to get rid of the landmines. My plea is this, Mr. Speaker. We, the UK, possess the equipment and indeed the skills to help rid the Ukraine of landmines. Could I ask the Secretary of State if he would look kindly on this request from the Ukraine?
Yeah.
The Honourable Gentleman, that's right, Honourable Gentleman, right. Yes, of course, we'll look at that issue. It hasn't appeared yet in the shopping list from the Ukrainians to me, but he is absolutely right. I visited Mariupol and other countries a few years ago and saw the minefields left behind after 2014, where the Russians destroyed everything and then left minefields across acres of farmland, just, I don't know what for, but to obviously impoverish the people there and leave their mark.
Daniel Kaczynski.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I very much welcome my right honourable friend's announcement that there will be a deployment of British Challenger 2 tanks to Poland to allow our Polish allies to send the Soviet-era tanks to Ukraine. But to my knowledge, there hasn't been an agreement within NATO to facilitate Polish MiG fighter jets to be sent to Ukraine. As this war continues, we are very much aware of the need for the Ukrainians to have additional air capability to take on the Russians. Will he use his good auspices in the coming NATO meetings to press our American allies on this issue?
Tuesday.
My honourable friend makes a good point. I think the one thing to point out is it's about really bilateral enabling rather than NATO as itself. As an organisation, but he is right. In fact, what the Ukrainians are after are ground attack aircraft more than they are air-to-air. So rather than the MiG-29s, the Su-30s, things like that, those sort of aeroplanes. I will certainly be raising it tomorrow with my US counterpart when I see him. I think it's important, but at the moment what we're focused on is the deep, long-range artillery.
Clive Apple.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Taking nothing away from the incredible performance of the Ukrainian army in defending its country, but all of us can't help but be struck by how completely useless the Russian forces have seem to be, and how inefficient they seem to be in organising themselves in this campaign. And having said that, there are increasing reports of mercenaries being used by Russians. I wonder if he could say to what degree they are involved in this conflict and whether there is any way to prevent them getting into positions where they can participate.
Wallace.
The honourable gentleman is absolutely right to point out the woeful performance. It's very hard when you know, I don't celebrate the loss of anyone's life, and when I see the huge casualty rates of Russian soldiers, as a former soldier, I think it is a disgrace, a betrayal of those young men. It's hard to have sympathy when it isn't just the generals clearly engaged in war crime and butcheries that we've seen, but some in Russia are mothers and wives left because of arrogance of generals. Poor performance and corruption has led many of those young men to their deaths. On his other point about, I've forgotten now, so I've slipped my mind. Mercenaries, yes, we see evidence of Wagner Group now being actively deployed in Ukraine. We've seen some Free Syrian fighters. We've seen media around Chechnya volunteers. Wagner Group is a pain and a pest, globally used, deniably apparently, but not really that deniable, as an arm of the Kremlin. We've seen it in Africa, we see it in Mali now, we've seen it in Libya, we've seen it elsewhere. I think the international community needs to come together to deal with something like Wagner, because whatever happens to them in Ukraine, and what we are seeing is they're not getting very good kit and they are being some of the first to die, so not a great recruiting advert for them, but what they are going to be a problem that we have to deal with.
Mr. Speaker, I would like to commend the Secretary of State for the actions he has taken to help Ukraine. In history, I think this is going to be seen as a genocide, not just war crimes, but genocide. Would the Secretary of State work with me to persuade the Foreign Office that it is the same as the Holodomor, although obviously different, in the 1930s, but it is going to be a genocide, as was the Holodomor?
I think what's really important on both use or the accusation of genocide and indeed war crimes is that, in a sense, it doesn't need a politician to make that allegation. We are lucky in this part of the world that we have the ICC, we have courts in The Hague, we have independent investigators who right now are collecting evidence and will be able to point a finger without any favour or political agenda. I think that's a really important difference between us and them. I think the Russians would love politicians in the West to be standing up pointing fingers, because the Russians could say, you would say that, wouldn't you? What I want to see is our respected judiciary and our law enforcement agencies gathering the evidence and then putting it to the people who politically we all think are clearly responsible for much of the problems in Ukraine.
Gavin Robinson.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Can I commend the Secretary of State for not only the statement today, but for his diligence and commitment over the last number of months. He may recall on a previous statement I did suggest that being so publicly explicit, NATO being so publicly explicit that there would be no troops on the ground was a vulnerability for Ukraine. And as we see, the Russians are becoming more desperate and diabolical in the tactics that they use, from rape to war crimes, genocide, the threat of chemical attack and potential technical and tactical nuclear attack. How sustainable does he believe it will be for the international community to give support, yes, but stay far removed?
Serve State.
Well, I think when NATO says NATO deployment, what they are saying is that as a NATO deployment, it's perfectly possible around the world for Britain and France and others to deploy unilaterally. You know, when we deployed into Poland recently, we're not doing it as a NATO country, we're doing it as Britain's support to one of our oldest allies. I think what happens in Ukraine over time, I mean, when this phase finishes, and let's hope it does soon, you know, we had orbital there. We had British trainers on the ground right up until pretty much the last. We sent the Rangers Battalion Regiment to train people on NLAWs just before the invasion. So we will inevitably wish to go back to help Ukraine in its long-term planning. It's very important we help them move out of crisis to a long-term plan, long-term ability to defend themselves, and Britain will always offer that opportunity with our training of troops. When we start doing that, that is open for debate, but you know, I don't rule anything out.
Ian Duncan Smith. Mr. Speaker, I commend my right honourable friend for his leadership in this matter and for the work of he and his colleagues in ensuring that our friends, the Ukrainians, are able to defend themselves. Can I just say to him, when I was recently in Lithuania, they made it clear to me that the Baltic states are deeply, deeply worried about some of the behaviour of one or two members of NATO. They commended the UK for their leadership against any kind of attempted settlement and on the slow behaviour of the Germans at the time until the UK pushed them to do more of the banking system of SWIFT, etc. But one of the things they were questioning me about was that, does NATO look strategically? My honourable friend just said just a few minutes ago that each individual country looks at these arms trades and transfers separately. But does NATO now look that once Ukraine has succeeded in defending itself from defeat, it must move on to the next bit of the posture, which is to be able to move on to the offensive? And does therefore NATO look at all of these arms, including aircraft, as raised by my honourable friend, as a role for them to be able to take the fight back to the Russians?
So, my right honourable friend, probably like me, served in northern Germany when permanent presence was used as one of the most important deterrents to the then Soviet Union, that we weren't just there for a short term, we were there for a very long period of time. And I think when we are seeking to find out and ask, actually not find out, NATO to come up with a long-term plan, it has to involve things like long-term containment of Russia. The best, defence is offence, he is correct, and I think certainly showing that you are well-equipped, capable, ready, deployable and deployed is one of the best ways of pushing and making President Putin cease what he is doing. I don't think that means NATO deploying outside of its borders, but I do mean it makes sure that we are very quick to respond and we are absolutely overmatching Russia in everything that it wishes to explore so that Putin doesn't dare do it.
Thank you very much indeed, Mr. Speaker. As this war has intensified, the distinction between providing defensive as opposed to offensive weapons has now largely disappeared as increasingly heavy equipment is being transferred. The Secretary of State had said previously to the House that he would support the provision of suitable aircraft to the Ukrainian Air Force. Further to the question asked by the Honourable Member for Shrewsbury and Atcham, what is his current assessment of the appetite of countries that have suitable aircraft that could be used in this new phase of the conflict to provide it to Ukraine?
Well, I think there are some who have appetite. There aren't many. I mean, some of this equipment is quite old. A lot of the MiG-29s in the east come from the fall of the Berlin Wall, so you can sort of gauge the age of those. But there are some useful aircraft, the ground attack aircraft in Europe, and as I say, I would defend any one of those nations' options of deploying them, and one of the ways we could help support them is by backfilling, by supplying our own Typhoons to patrol their skies, etc., where to do it. So I think the hunt is still on. I'm very happy to, if anyone comes forward, to support them. Sometimes they've been updated with third countries' equipment, which gives those countries a veto, and I will also work to persuade those third countries to release any holds on them as well.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Russia has clearly suffered serious logistical issues in this first phase of the conflict. Can I ask my right honourable friend what other lessons we have learnt from the first phase of the conduct, and to what extent we can use those lessons as we enter into what seems to be a new phase?
Well, I think the first lesson, which don't take Russia at its word, take it on its action, is absolutely, I think, the most important lesson for many in the international community, which we, I suppose, gave up on a long time ago. But nevertheless, I think that's the first thing. I think there's going to be a lot of lessons. I think I wouldn't rush into it, because we need to also learn from the Ukrainians. The Ukrainians are quite rightly focused on fighting, rather than a sort of a feedback loop to us, which will be essential in understanding it. I think the big lesson here is we have to prove to the world that ripping up international law, being more brutal than your adversary, still doesn't get you to win. Because there's one calculation I think President Putin and his generals have is, we don't care about human life, we don't care about international law, and if we just maintain that, somehow we'll achieve victory, irrespective of the cost and there's human suffering. International community has to be totally unified in demonstrating that as folly.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Can I thank the Secretary of State for his update on the deployment of UK personnel along NATO's eastern flank. But can he detail what role they are playing in the humanitarian response, including supporting the processing of visas for Ukrainian refugees? And can I also ask him, alongside all the military equipment, is the UK looking at delivering potassium iodide to civilians in Ukraine?
Just on medical supplies, I know my friend, the Right Honourable, the Health Secretary, has provided significant amounts of health stocks, but I'm very happy to look at that further for her. Look, on the issue of visas, we've offered, and any request from the Home Office we have fulfilled. If they ask for more, they'll get more, if that is what is required to speed up that process.
Stephen McPartland.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'd like to pay tribute to our brave Ukrainian friends and commend the Secretary of State on his steadfast support for them. Stevenage is home to NBDA, which manufactures brimstone. Can the Secretary of State clarify whether or not we will be making brimstone available? And also, what can we do to upgrade the Ukrainians' advanced cyber capabilities to disrupt Russian communication, command and control?
I'm grateful to my more friend. On the latter, I can't really comment on those sort of operational issues. I think all I would say is Britain and Ukraine have had a long-held cyber relationship many years before this invasion, and we continue to understand their cyber needs. And MBDA have done an amazing job, the multinational consortium, including BAE and others, in those making of those weapon systems which are being used right now. As I've said, I don't have any objection in principle to some of the brimstone variants being deployed into Ukraine. And in principle, we agreed to sell brimstone anti-sea some months ago, 18 months, 2 years ago. If we do decide to put brimstone in, we will, of course, make sure that both the chairs of Select Committee and the front benches are notified. They are still a short-range missile. They have the Block 1s of a range of about 7 kilometres. They're not, they're not strategic, and I think the honourable member opposite who asked a question about defensive and offensive, I think what we've moved now to is tactical versus strategic. We're still not in a strategic place. A brimstone would be a tactical weapon system with its range, but nevertheless a very, very efficient and capable system.
Stephen Kinnock.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Secretary of State will have seen the recent Defence Select Committee report, which was very critical of the government's decision to deploy the Royal Navy in terms of basically taking over border force and dealing with the small boats issue. It defined that policy as ill-defined and prematurely announced. What assessment has he made of the risk that the Operation Isotrope could lead to the diversion of scarce Royal Navy resources at this time where the focus surely has to be on our national security and on deterring Vladimir Putin's aggression?
Tuesday.
The honourable gentleman will be relieved to know that none, the P2000 patrol boats weren't going anywhere other than the UK shores or indeed inshore, so not inland vehicles, nor will the Batch 1 OPVs. They weren't going to go anywhere else. The rest of it has really been about bringing a military command and control mindset and the ability to mass and mash together intelligence, surveillance, reconnaissance capabilities to have a better command and control umbrella over the whole thing. That's what we're trying to do. That's what we're starting to deliver. And it's as much about a cultural change as it was anything else.
Mark Polsey.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. On a recent visit to Georgia with the APPG, we saw joint working between Georgian troops and NATO personnel, largely from the countries that he referred to earlier. Could you say a little more about the joint working that we're doing with Ukrainian forces to enable them to use to maximum effect the very valuable military equipment that the UK is providing?
State.
The Georgians are very important partners for us around the Black Sea, and obviously they themselves know what it's like to be at the wrong end of a Russian invasion, and it's very important that we help Georgia as resilient to that. It's important that we also recognise that having consolidated what Russia then tries to do in those countries, such as Georgia, which is divide, corrupt, and continue to manipulate. And that's why it's very important that Britain's relationship with Georgia is a long and enduring relationship to help them with their own resilience.
Williams.
Delivering the defensive equipment which has been so vital to Ukraine's success in resisting the Russian invasion has been really instrumental, and I think the government deserves all credit for its work in this respect. Because the Secretary of State states what are the UK's current overarching aims in this conflict and confirm that support for Ukraine will continue long-term irrespective of who occupies number 10.
Look, I am grateful, thank you for his comments. Look, our objective is to push or help Ukraine push back Russia from both its actions since February, and if Ukraine takes a choice to continue to try and push Russia out of its illegally occupied territories, then of course the West and the international community will stand by them in doing that. I think in its simplest form, Britain wants to help Ukraine be free to choose. What it chooses is slightly secondary to the fact it has the freedom to choose in the first place as a sovereign state. That's what we're all trying to work for, and the only person who doesn't want to do that is Russia.
Rebel.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, one of the main lessons from this conflict seems to be that, alongside the courageous resistance of the Ukrainian people and the military, one of the reasons it hasn't gone to plan for Russia is because of the failure of their logistics, seemingly running out of food, fuel and other supplies. Could my right honourable friend confirm that one of the lessons that we will learn and the whole world should learn from this is that top quality logistics, such as the UK armed forces have, is even more essential perhaps than military manpower?
It's really important, and we see from photographs Russian soldiers going to war with not much equipment, with poor equipment, rations that are years out of date, not just a few days or weeks, and all of that has a horrendous effect on morale. We see them at war with cheap handheld radios, not their own radios because they don't work, and we see them badly prepared. Bad battle preparation leads to defeat often. That's often the mess they're in. You saw some very expensive equipment got stuck in the mud because they used cheap tyres from somewhere else. Those things matter. It's also an important lesson for our defence that sometimes the less sexy things are actually the things you should invest in. They're often the things first cut when the Treasury comes calling and you pay for it in the end.
Ben Bradshaw.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Is he concerned, though, that if Putin is allowed to retain the territories in the south and east that he has invaded, that he will claim that and be able to claim that to some extent as a kind of victory? And in that context, What does he think of the comments of retired General Philip Breedlove, the former NATO commander in Europe today, who said now might be the time to at least consider, by NATO or a coalition of the willing, troops on the ground in the north and west of Ukraine so that your Ukrainian resources are freed up to fight in the south and east?
Same state.
It's definitely a valid suggestion insofar as if we were to fast forward to a frozen conflict where 80% of Ukraine was still sovereign Ukraine, then it is entirely up for Ukraine to decide who it wants to invite onto its territory and for what purposes, just like us being there as we were under Orbital. I mean, people seem to forget that until this invasion, Ukraine was this sovereign country, yes, with 2 occupied parts, but if Ukraine wanted British soldiers, as it did, it had Swedish soldiers, it had Canadian on its territory. We went exercising with 5 Airborne Brigade, last year, etc. It's all possible to do, and I think, if Putin decides to hunker down into some form of further frozen conflict, we should remember 2 things. One is he'll be back for more, because that's what he did in 2014, and the second thing is he still doesn't control Ukraine.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Today is Anzac Day, when we commemorate the sacrifice of Australians and New Zealanders in conflict. Will my right honourable friend join me in paying tribute to those who lost their lives at Gallipoli and since? And will he agree with me that Australia and New Zealand are important partners in supporting Ukraine now, not least with New Zealand's Hercules aircraft and crew, which recently arrived in the UK?
Yes, I think it's really important to remember the sacrifice made by New Zealand and Australia, effectively in a theatre of a war so far away. It's also important to recognise their solidarity to this conflict. Australia has given the United Kingdom funds to help purchase equipment for Ukraine. Australia and New Zealand recognise that this is really a war of values. This is a battle to show that the despot cannot win and must not be allowed to win, and they are doing everything they can to stand by us. We shouldn't forget that. We should also be very grateful for it.
Ready?
Mr. Speaker, how much of his department's spending in Ukraine is being counted as official development assistance, and what steps is he taking to make sure that ODA spending by other departments is not being spent at the expense of other situations around the world that are in desperate need of aid?
I understand the path he's trying to plough, whatever it is. Look, well, I'll send you a letter. I don't think any, from what I can tell. It certainly doesn't appear in my submissions that this is a category, this is a diversion. This is simply, what can we help the Ukrainians? How much is it costing? Can we afford to take risk in our own supplies? If not, can we buy it from someone else? And will the Treasury reimburse us? It's really simple.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. The Secretary of State is absolutely right to salute the bravery of the heroic Ukrainian forces and to highlight the failures of the Russians, but we shouldn't in any way allow that to enable us to be complacent about the threat that they continue to provide. I hear what the Secretary of State said about the Ukrainians deciding at where we go from here, but does he agree with me there can be no return to normality of relationships with Russia until they've got out of all of the areas that they've invaded during this invasion?
There can be no return to normality for President Putin and his inner circle. What they have done, despite international warning from presidents and prime ministers endlessly asking them not to do it, is they have built their own cage and they're living in it. And from my point of view, they need to remain in it.
Christian Jardy.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. We've seen already that the war in Ukraine is not going to be brief. Neither are Vladimir Putin's intentions going to be limited. So with that in mind, can the Secretary of State tell us if the government is beginning to look long-term strategically about the implications of Ukraine and the ambitions of Vladimir Putin?
Yes, I think there are 2 parts to this. One is, how do we, in some form of commission or get together to help plan Ukraine's long-term defence, its posture and its equipping of itself, because just like any other army, it will be exhausted and worn out, but also when it comes to rebuilding that country. It'll be very important that we don't forget, when all this is over, that we have to rebuild that country. We have to help them rebuild that country, not just Britain, not just the EU, not just the international community, but also over a long term. Russia is destroying things. You only have to see the photographs, that you don't rebuild them in a few weeks. And so if the international community is serious about sending a message to Putin, it's not just militarily now, it's about long-term development and the access to economic freedoms and prosperity that will demonstrate the difference between Russia and Ukraine.
David.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Within the very near future, it seems to be extremely likely that both Sweden and Finland will apply to join NATO. Can the Secretary of State indicate to the House what commitments we have given as a country to stand by Finland and Sweden should they face Russian aggression?
So, irrespective of whether they join NATO, I talked earlier about the Joint Expeditionary Force. For me, it's inconceivable or incomprehensible that Britain would not, for example, go to the aid of Sweden should it be attacked or invaded. It is a fellow European country. It is a country with huge links to our country and the same values, etc. And one of the reasons that JEF is such an important grouping of nations, both Finland and Sweden, plus 8 NATO countries, is that we totally share the values. We have the same professionalism in our armed forces and capabilities, and Britain signed, I think, an MOU in 2014 originally with Sweden to further our defence cooperation. We're working to see what more we can do in the very near future.
Jonathan Edwards.
Mr. Speaker, Ukraine is facing a financial crisis, with the FT reporting that revenues are around a half of pre-war levels, with a fiscal gap projected to be $7 billion for this month alone. The IMF have approved an administered account for countries to make donations in through a secure vehicle. Has the UK made a contribution to the account, and what efforts are being made with partners to provide Ukraine with hard cash?
Well, I can't tell you. I know we've given aid, I think over £100 million in aid, but as far as the sort of IMF fund, I can write to the honourable member with those details. I know the United States, I think, announced a significant amount of funding for Ukraine only over the weekend, but he's absolutely right. That's as much where we need to focus as on the military aid.
Margaret Farley.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I thank the Secretary of State for his statement. The International Atomic Energy Authority have announced that they'll be undertaking a mission to Chernobyl after gunfire in the area raised concerns of the potential for a major radiation leak. Can the Secretary of State confirm what discussions he has had with the IAEA and what they expect to find there?
So, if I'm not mistaken, the relationship with the IAEA is the Foreign Office and the BAEs, but I will be happy to find out for her. Of course, we're concerned about activity around Chernobyl and anything else, and I don't think it was by accident Russia did what it did around Chernobyl.
That ends that statement. But before I call the Minister to make a statement on the Government's response to the fan-led football review of football governance, I have to put on record my disappointment that the Government has apparently already trailed its response extensively to the media. Seems to me that we have a very courteous Minister that somehow Downing Street seems to ignore and decide to put everything that this House should hear first out of the media. It's not satisfactory, and I've got to say, not only is it discourteous to this House, it's discourteous to the honourable member for Cheltenham and Aylesford, who has put in so much work in this area. And the fact that anybody could believe that you could cut out the member must be very, very disappointing, because I'm going to tell you now that it will be, when she catches my eye, given more time in which she can put the case on all the hard work that she's done. And it might just be a lesson for government to stop being discourteous. Think about the people who get elected. That's on all sides. So please, I don't blame the Minister. I know that Downing Street love getting these messages out on a Sunday night. It's somehow, why have they not recognised that even the Prime Minister is a member of this House? It might be good for us all to hear it first. So like I say, it's not normally the case that the member will be given extra time, but I'm reassuring the honourable member and the House that more time will be given. Right, Minister.
Okay, this way.
Thank you.
Right, no, looking at my legs.